The world of the frontier began not with comfort, but with distance. For families and wanderers who left behind the towns and villages of the eastern lands, the journey westward or deeper into the unsettled wilderness was a long, uncertain passage. They packed wagons with tools, sacks of flour, a few salted cuts of meat, perhaps a Bible, a journal, or one treasured keepsake that reminded them of the home they were leaving behind. The rest of their belongings were left to memory, for space was always short, and the road was always long. The wagon wheels creaked on muddy paths, sometimes sinking deep into ruts carved by travelers who had come before them. Horses or oxen pulled heavy loads, while children trudged beside their parents, clutching small bundles or clutching their mother's hand. The air was filled with the smell of wood smoke, damp earth, and the constant ache of anticipation. Every mile carried them further from familiarity and deeper into a land of silence, where the only sounds were the wind sweeping through open fields, the rustle of leaves in forests, and the call of distant birds. The days were marked by work. Setting up camp meant gathering fallen branches for firewood, unrolling blankets on the hard ground, and watching carefully for wolves or bears that prowled the edges of the dark. Nights brought the kind of quiet most of us will never know today, a silence so complete that the flicker of firelight seemed like a fragile shield against an endless, waiting wilderness. Sometimes the night was broken by storms, with rain drumming on wagon canvas and lightning flashing across the vast black sky, reminding weary travelers just how small they were against nature's immensity. Food was plain, often repetitive. Cornmeal, beans, and dried meat filled most meals, with bread baked in heavy iron skillets when flour could be spared. Fresh fruit or vegetables were rare, and when someone managed to pick berries or find wild greens along the road, it felt like a feast. The journey was not only a test of body, but of spirit. Every creek crossing, every broken wheel, every day of unending mud or dust was a reminder that survival was not promised, it had to be fought for, step by step. Yet, amid the hardship, there was also hope. The horizon promised new land, new possibilities, and for some, the dream of freedom, far from crowded towns or rigid hierarchies. Families whispered around the fire about fertile soil, wide rivers, and a life where they could shape their own destiny with their own hands. As you imagine yourself there, drifting with the weary travelers, picture the stars overhead, bright, countless, and close enough to feel like companions on the road. These stars watched over every wagon and every lonely figure trudging west, carrying not only supplies, but the fragile weight of human determination. And so, the story of frontier survival begins with tired feet, creaking wagons, and the quiet heartbeat of people who dared to leave behind comfort in search of something unknown. After weeks of travel, there came a moment when the journey ended and the work of true survival began. The families who had pushed into the frontier found themselves standing before open fields, thick forests, or river valleys, land that seemed untouched, vast, and silent. There were no streets, no neighbors, no roofs waiting for them. Only earth and trees, sky and wind. If they wanted to live, they had to build life from the ground up. The first task was shelter. Men took axes to the forest, felling trees that had stood for centuries. Each swing of the blade echoed through the wilderness, mixing with the smell of pine and sap. Logs were dragged, shaped, and stacked, not with speed or comfort, but with urgency, for the weather would not wait. Women tended the fires, and the children patched torn clothes, and gathered whatever roots or berries they could find nearby. Even small hands were put to work, carrying stones, fetching water, holding lanterns as daylight slipped too quickly into dusk. The cabins that rose from the earth were not graceful structures. They were rough, uneven, with gaps between logs stuffed with moss, clay, or whatever could be found to keep out the cold. Roofs leaked when the rain was heavy, and floors were little more than packed dirt. Yet these cabins represented safety, the fragile barrier between human life and the relentless wilderness outside. Then came the first winter. It arrived earlier than most were ready for. Snow drifted across the fields, and ice formed thick on rivers that once provided water and fish. The cold seeped into the cabin walls, finding every gap, chilling fingers and toes, and turning every chore into an exhausting battle. Firewood became as precious as bread. Men rose before dawn to chop frozen logs, hands blistered and numb, while women kept the hearth burning, carefully rationing each piece of wood to make it last through the night. Food grew scarce. Hunting was unpredictable. Sometimes a deer was caught, its meat salted and smoked, enough to last weeks. Other times the forest seemed empty, as though every creature had vanished into silence. Families relied on dried beans, cornmeal, and what little flour remained from the long journey. A single loaf of bread could feel like a feast. A pot of stew, thin but warm, became a comfort that carried them through the biting cold. Illness was constant. The cold weakened bodies, and without proper medicine, even a fever or cough could prove dangerous. Mothers wrapped their children in every scrap of cloth, whispering prayers through the night as the wind howled against the thin walls. Still, hope burned quietly in the hearts of those who endured. Every sunrise was a victory, every thawing day a step closer to spring. In those long winter nights, families would huddle close to the fire, sharing stories of the land they left behind, of dreams yet to come, of faith in the idea that all of this hardship was building toward something greater. The firelight flickered across tired faces, softening the lines of worry, reminding them that they were not alone in their struggle. And so, the first winter passed slowly, painfully, but with quiet endurance. The settlers learned that survival on the frontier was not a single act of bravery, but 1,000 small acts repeated every day: chopping wood, stirring stew, patching a leaky roof, comforting a crying child. These small victories were what kept life alive, even in the cruelest season. When the grip of winter finally loosened, the world outside the cabin changed. The snow melted into mud, the rivers swelled, and the forests burst into green. Spring was not a season of rest, but of urgency. The settlers knew that what they planted in those first weeks would determine whether they ate through the next winter. Survival was no longer about fire and shelter, it was about coaxing life from the soil. Men and women worked side by side in the fields. The ground, still wet and heavy from melted snow, had to be broken with crude plows or even simple hoes if no animal could be spared to pull. Corn, beans, and squash were planted. sometimes with seeds carried from the old homeland, sometimes bartered from native people who had cultivated the land for generations. Each seed was placed carefully, almost like a prayer, a hope sealed into the earth. Water had to be hauled daily. Buckets were lowered into streams or wells, carried heavy across uneven ground. Clothes were washed by hand, scrubbed against stones until knuckles ached, then laid to dry in the sharp spring sun. Fire still had to be kept alive, for cooking never ceased, and every meal was a victory over hunger. Children, though often too young to work the fields, were given chores that matched their size. They fetched sticks for kindling, kept watch over chickens or goats, or scattered seed in the garden with clumsy little hands. In the evenings, their laughter sometimes echoed faintly across the fields, a reminder that even in hardship, childhood could not be fully silenced. Isolation, however, pressed heavy on the adults. Days stretched into weeks without visitors, without neighbors, without the comfort of familiar voices beyond their own small family. Letters, if they came at all, arrived months late, carried by riders who braved the long distances between settlements. Many pioneers described this loneliness as a deeper challenge than hunger or cold, the sense of being forgotten by the rest of the world. Swallowed by endless forests and sky, summer brought more work, not less. Crops had to be weeded, animals fed and watered, and repairs made constantly to cabins battered by storms. The sun burned hot on bent backs as sweat dripped. Insects swarmed, mosquitoes, flies, and gnats thick in the humid air. Nights were warm, but rest was shallow, broken by the sounds of wolves in the distance or the endless chorus of crickets. Still, summer carried its rewards. Wild berries ripened in the thickets. Rivers offered fish to those patient enough to wait with lines in hand. The fields, once barren, grew tall with corn that whispered in the wind. Families could sit outside in the fading light of day, listening to frogs in the marshes, watching fireflies drift lazily in the dusk. For a moment, the frontier felt less like an enemy and more like a home untamed, but quietly generous to those who labored for its gifts. Evenings in summer had their own rhythm. The chores would end, the fire would be lit, and stories would rise against, some of faith, some of memory, some simply to fill the long silence. The wilderness pressed in on every side, but inside those walls of rough-hewn logs there was warmth, companionship, and a fragile sense of belonging. And so, as the frontier seasons turned, life became a cycle of constant effort, of patience, and of waiting, always waiting for the promise of harvest. Life on the frontier was not only shaped by hunger, labor, and loneliness. It was haunted by the constant presence of danger. The wilderness was beautiful, yes, but it was not gentle. Every day carried the risk of sudden disaster, and the settlers quickly learned that the land itself was as much an enemy as it was a provider. The storms came first. Without warning, black clouds would roll across the horizon, swallowing the sun and draping the land in a heavy silence before the sky split open with thunder. Rain poured in sheets, drumming on cabin roofs, turning fields into rivers of mud. Winds howled like voices, bending trees until they cracked and splintered, sending branches crashing dangerously close to the fragile shelters people had built. Families huddled inside, clutching one another. whispering prayers that the roof would hold, that the lightning would strike elsewhere, that the swollen rivers would not rise too high. And then there were the winters that returned, each one a reminder that survival was temporary, never guaranteed. Some cabins collapsed under the weight of heavy snow. Others trapped their inhabitants inside with ice and drifts so tall they buried the very doorways. The cold seeped into bones, slowing movements, clouding thoughts, making every small task fetching water, chopping wooden ordeal. A misstep in the snow could mean frostbite. A slip on the ice could mean a broken leg, with no doctor for miles, no medicine, and no chance of rescue. Animals, too, posed constant threats. Wolves prowled the edges of settlements, their howls carrying across the night, filling hearts with dread. Bears wandered into clearings in search of food, powerful and unpredictable. Smaller creatures, too, carried danger snakes hidden in tall grass, their bites venomous and often fatal. Swarms of insects spreading fevers and chills. Even rats gnawing through stores of grain and bringing sickness into homes. Perhaps most feared of all were accidents. On the frontier, the smallest injury could mean death. An axe slipping during woodcutting, a hand crushed while building, a child stumbling into a fire. These were not rare tragedies, but common ones. Without medicine, without hospitals, wounds could fester, infections spread, and lives could end quietly, cruelly, from what in a town or city would have been easily treated. Childbirth was another shadow over frontier life. Women gave birth with only other women to help. No doctors, no clean tools, no safety. Many mothers did not survive. Many infants were buried in the small graveyards settlers carved into the earth near their cabins. These quiet graves, marked with wooden crosses, told the true cost of survival more honestly than any story of courage. Yet, even with all these dangers, people endured. They learned to read the skies for signs of storms, to store food high where animals could not reach it, to build stronger cabins, to walk carefully, to help each other when accidents came. Children grew up learning fear and caution as naturally as they learned to speak. The dangers never disappeared, but they became part of life's rhythm, an unending reminder that the frontier demanded respect, patience, and sacrifice. There were moments, too, when danger revealed resilience. Families who lost crops to storms replanted. Those who buried children carried their grief and continued on day by day. Neighbors, when close enough to reach, came together in times of sickness or fire, proving that even in the harshest wilderness, the human spirit clung to kindness. To live on the frontier was to live with uncertainty. The crack of thunder, the growl of a wolf, the snap of a branch in the dark hole were reminders that the world beyond the cabin door was vast, untamed, and indifferent. And yet, it was also the same world that offered fertile soil, clean rivers, and the possibility of a future carved out of wilderness. The dangers of the frontier did not stop people, they defined them. And in surviving those dangers, they built not only lives, but legacies. If the storms and winters of the frontier were cruel to the body, then loneliness was cruel to the mind. For many, the wilderness was not just a land of trees and rivers, it was a silence so vast it seemed to swallow voices, to echo endlessly through the heart. On the frontier, there were no crowded markets, No church bells ringing in the morning, no neighbor's footsteps on cobblestones. There was only the creak of wood, the sigh of wind, the call of distant birds. And in that quiet, loneliness grew heavier with every passing season for families. Isolation meant that the burden of companionship fell almost entirely within the walls of a single cabin. Husbands and wives leaned on one another for conversation, encouragement, and comfort, yet the weight of survival often left little time for tenderness. Parents spoke to their children, but the children's words were often innocent, unformed, unable to fill the vast silence adults felt pressing down upon them. The absence of friends, of neighbors, of simple laughter shared. Across a fence, this absence was a wound that could not be patched with wood or fire. For those who settled entirely, alone single men or women who braved the wilderness without kinva, loneliness was sharper still. Days passed without another human voice. They rose in the morning to tend to chores, worked the soil, carried water, cut wood, ate meals in silence, and lay down at night to the sound of their own breath. Many wrote journals, their words spilling out onto paper as though to remind themselves that they still existed, that someone someday might read their story and know they had lived. Others carved marks into wood, notches to count the days, the weeks, the months. Each line proof that they had endured another measure of time. Letters offered a thin connection to the world beyond. When they arrived weeks or months late, they were read and reread until the ink began to fade, the paper soft from being folded and unfolded. News of births, of deaths, of wars, of weather in the old towns felt like a voice calling out from another world. The settlers clung to these letters, tucking them safely away, bringing them out in the darkest evenings as though the words themselves were warm. Loneliness was not only an ache of the heart, but a danger to the mind. Some settlers began to speak aloud to themselves, filling the air with their own voice so that the silence did not seem so complete. Some carved crude dolls for their children or for themselves, so there would always be another face in the room. Others turned inward to faith, kneeling alone to pray, their whispered hymns rising into the rafters of the cabin. Religion often became both shield and companion, a way of assuring oneself that though people were scarce, God was near. When neighbors did exist, miles away but reachable, their presence became lifelines. A visit, though rare, was a sacred event. People traveled on horseback or by foot, sometimes for hours, to share a meal, exchange seeds, borrow tools, or simply sit and talk. Stories flowed easily during those visits dailies of hardships, of lost cattle, of births and deaths, of weather patterns, of news carried from far-off settlements. Laughter, too, returned in those moments, ringing out against the walls of log cabins like a sound rediscovered. For children, isolation often meant growing up with fewer friends, but also with a deeper bond to siblings and parents. They invented games with sticks, stones, and imagination. They listened eagerly to stories told by firelight, their young minds carrying forward the oral traditions of families who had little else to pass on. Childhood on the frontier was lonely, yes, but it was also rich with creativity, forged in silence, strengthened by necessity, and yet loneliness never vanished entirely. It lingered, like the whisper of wind through cracks in the cabin walls. It reminded settlers that they were small, fragile, and far from the familiar world. Many endured it with quiet strength, building routines to fill their days, pouring themselves into labor, keeping hands busy so the mind did not wander too far. But others, worn down by silence, gave up. Some returned to the towns they had left behind, unable to endure the emptiness. Others stayed, but their spirits dimmed, their laughter stilled. On the frontier, loneliness was as much a predator as wolves or storms. It crept unseen. It gnawed slowly, and it demanded courage of a different kind, not the courage to fight, but the courage to wait, to hope, and to keep believing that tomorrow might bring company. It is hard, from our world today, to imagine such silence. Yet, for the pioneers, this silence was the sound of their lives. It was both the enemy and the backdrop of their courage. Life on the frontier was not lived in hours, but in tasks. Each sunrise did not bring a choice of how to spend the day. It brought a command. The land, the animals, the weather, the seasons, these forces dictated what had to be done. And if it was not done, if the chores were ignored or postponed, then the wilderness punished swiftly. Survival was not a romantic dream of freedom. It was an endless cycle of labor, heavy with sweat and urgency. The first and most vital task was food. Farming was backbreaking and uncertain. Settlers broke the earth with crude wooden or iron plows, often pulled not by oxen, but by themselves. The soil could be stubborn, full of roots and stones that tore at the blade. Hands blistered, backs bent, and sweat poured under the sun. Seeds were carefully pressed into the ground: corn, wheat, beans, potatoes, each one a prayer. For if the crop failed, there was no grocery, no market, no easy way to buy more. Hunger stood waiting at the edge of every season. Women's hands were rarely idle. From dawn until after dark, they kept the household running with a rhythm that never ceased. They cooked meals from scratch bread, kneaded and baked in wood stoves or ovens built from stone. Meat preserved with salt or smoke, vegetables boiled in heavy iron pots. They churned butter, skimmed cream, rendered fat into soap, and turned wool or flax into thread. Clothing was mended and patched until it could be worn no longer. Babies were carried on the hip while hands stirred pots or kneaded dough. The work was constant, demanding, and invisible to the outside world. Yet it was the heart of survival. Water, too, was labor. Few cabins had wells, so buckets had to be hauled from streams or rivers, often at great distance. In winter, ice had to be broken, jagged and cold against the fingers, to reach the water beneath. Fires were another constant task: fires to warm the home, to cook food, to dry wet clothes. Chopping wood was a daily ritual, the steady thud of the axe echoing in the stillness. Piles of logs had to be kept high, for without fuel, a family could freeze before the season ended. Children were not spared from work. As soon as they could walk and lift, they carried water, gathered eggs, picked berries, weeded gardens, and watched younger siblings. Older boys often helped with plowing, herding, or hunting, while girls learned to spin, sew, and tend to the household. Childhood was brief on the frontier. Necessity demanded that small hands share the burden. Yet many children found joy even within labor, racing barefoot through fields to gather kindling, laughing as they chased chickens back into coops, or humming tunes while grinding grain. Meals were simple but precious. Cornbread, beans, salted pork, dried fruit, and occasionally wild game formed the staples. Fresh vegetables were rare in winter, so families relied heavily on preserved foods, pickles, dried apples, smoked meats. Every bite carried the weight of labor done months earlier. A jar of jam was not just sweetness. It was summer captured and saved against the bitterness of winter. Beyond food, settlers had to build and repair constantly. Cabins shifted in the earth, roofs leaked, fences sagged, tools broke. Every man, and often every woman, became carpenter, blacksmith, and mason by necessity. A loose hinge, a missing shingle, or a broken handle could not wait for a craftsman. It had to be fixed by the people who lived there. Even children learned early how to whittle, patch, and repair. Survival was not about waiting for help. It was about becoming the help. Then there were the animals. Chickens had to be fed and guarded from foxes. Cows had to be milked at dawn, rain or shine. Horses required grooming, shoeing, and care. Sheep provided wool but demanded endless watching against wolves. Animals were not luxuries. They were lifelines. Without them, there was no milk, no eggs, no transport, no wool, no meat. But with them came ceaseless responsibility. If a predator struck or illness spread, a family could lose everything. Evenings did not bring rest so much as another round of labor. Candles had to be made from tallow or beeswax. Clothing was mended by firelight, needles glinting in dim rooms. Parents taught children their letters or read aloud from the Bible, the flickering glow casting shadows on the walls. Nights were filled with the crackle of the fire, the scratching of thread through cloth, the low murmur of prayers. And yet, despite the endless labor, there were moments of quiet satisfaction. The sight of bread rising golden from the oven, the smell of wood smoke curling upward into the cold night, the comfort of children gathered close, cheeks flushed from the fire. Work was relentless, but it gave meaning. It tied people to the land, to each other, and to the fragile hope that tomorrow's toil would bring survival. Frontier life was a rhythm of sweat and silence, hardship and persistence. Each task was small on its own, pulling water, chopping wood, patching clothes, but together they built the fragile bridge that carried families across another season. If the endless work of survival was one constant of frontier life, danger was the other. The wilderness was vast, untamed. To live on the edge of settlement was to live in the shadow of threat. From the moment a cabin was built and a family staked its claim, they understood that every day carried risks they could neither control nor predict. The most immediate dangers often came from the natural world. Forests were alive with predators, wolves prowling in packs, coyotes slinking at the edges of farms, and bears whose strength could overturn a pig pen or scatter sheep in moments. Stories were whispered of panthers, wildcats that moved silently through the trees, their screams echoing like human cries in the night. To walk alone in the woods after dusk was to step into the unknown, where a rustle could mean only wind, or it could mean a beast watching from the shadows. But it was not only predators that threatened. The land itself held hazards. Rivers ran swift and cold, claiming the lives of children who slipped while fetching water, or men who tried to ford them with wagons. Fires, set accidentally by sparks or lightning, could devour acres of forest and reduce cabins to ash. Storms tore across plains with a fury that rattled windows, uprooted trees, and flattened crops in an instant. In winter, blizzards came suddenly, suffocating the world in white, blinding travelers, entrapping families inside their homes with dwindling supplies. Yet the most feared dangers were the ones unseen. Illness and disease swept through frontier settlements like silent predators. Cholera, dysentery, smallpox, and influenza could strike without warning. A single contaminated well or a cough in a crowded cabin could ignite an outbreak. With few doctors and little medicine, families relied on folk remedies, herbal brews, and prayer. Sometimes they worked, often they did not. Children were particularly vulnerable, and many families buried little ones before they reached their 5th birthdays. The sound of grief was as much a part of the frontier as the ringing of an axe or the creak of wagon wheels. Injuries, too, were constant. An axe slipping while chopping wood, a horse throwing its rider, a plow blade crushing a foot. Any of these could cripple a person for life. In cities, such wounds might heal with proper care. On the frontier, infection set in quickly. Without antibiotics, a simple cut could fester into fever and death. Families learned to clean wounds with whiskey, bind them with cloth, and hope. But often hope was not enough. The frontier also carried the heavy shadow of conflict. As settlers pushed into lands that had long belonged to indigenous peoples, tensions sometimes erupted into violence. For both sides, survival meant defending home and family. Stories of raids, ambushes, and retaliation spread through settlements, heightening fear. Many lived with the knowledge that the land beneath their feet was contested, its peace fragile and uncertain. For women, dangers carried another form. Isolation meant childbirth was often faced alone, or with only a midwife present. Complications that might be manageable in a town hospital could turn deadly in a remote cabin. Every pregnancy carried risk, and every birth was a gamble between life and death. Women bore these risks with quiet strength, knowing their survival ensured their families' survival as well. And yet, despite this constant closeness to death, frontier families endured. They developed resilience born of necessity. Children learned early not to wander too far, not to drink from unclean streams, not to leave fires unattended. Families taught one another how to read the sky for storms, how to spot signs of illness in animals, how to avoid danger whenever possible. Fear was a teacher, and those who learned its lessons survived. Faith and community also helped settlers face danger. Families prayed before meals, sang hymns by firelight, and trusted in a higher power to guide them through trials. Neighbors shared remedies, advice, and warnings. If a storm destroyed one family's barn, others came with hammers and nails to rebuild. If disease struck, neighbors carried food to the sick or cared for orphaned children. Danger was everywhere, but so too was human solidarity. Living on the frontier meant accepting that danger was never far away. A single misstep, a single unlucky turn could bring tragedy. But rather than surrender, settlers adapted. They carried scars, buried loved ones, and kept going. Each morning they rose, stepped into a world full of risks, and continued the endless work of survival. That persistence, quiet and unyielding, was itself a form of courage. Life on the frontier was often described as lonely, and in many ways it was. Families might live miles apart, separated by thick woods, rolling prairies, or winding rivers. The nearest neighbor could be an hour's walk away, and the closest town a full day's ride. And yet, despite the isolation, something remarkable happened. Out of scattered cabins and lonely homesteads grew a sense of community, a fragile but powerful web of human connection that helped people endure the harsh realities of frontier life. At first, survival required every ounce of a family's energy. But once cabins were raised and fields planted, once the immediate struggle for food and shelter eased, settlers began to look outward. They sought connection, not only for companionship, but also for safety. To face the wilderness alone was nearly impossible. To face it with neighbors was a promise of hope. The first sign of community often came with the sound of a hammer. When a family needed to build a barn, neighbors gathered, tools in hand. These barn raisings were more than construction projects. They were social events, bringing together men, women, and children from across miles of wild land. In a single day, with many hands working in unison, a barn could rise from an empty clearing. As the structure took shape, so too did a bond of trust. The settlers knew that someday, when their own turn came, the same neighbors would arrive with saws, hammers, and strong backs to return the favor. Women formed their own networks. Quilting bees became not just opportunities to stitch together fabric, but also to weave together friendships. As hands worked thread through cloth, stories were told, worries shared, and laughter passed around like bread at a table. Quilts themselves became symbols of community, patches of fabric, each with its own history, joined to create something warmer and stronger than any single piece could be on its own. Church gatherings, too, became lifelines. In remote settlements, a preacher might visit only once every few weeks, traveling on horseback with a Bible and a hymn book. When he arrived, families would come from miles around, dressed in their best clothes, to worship in a log chapel, or sometimes simply beneath the open sky. These services were more than religious. They were affirmations of community, a reminder that even in the wilderness, people were bound together by shared beliefs and hope. Children played after sermons, couples courted under watchful eyes, and friendships deepened. Faith was both spiritual comfort and social glue. Schools followed. In many settlements, the first school was nothing more than a one-room cabin with rough benches and a single teacher. Lessons were simple: reading, writing, arithmetic. But for children, school was more than learning. It was the joy of companionship, the chance to laugh whisper, and grow with others their own age. Parents, too, saw schools as investments in survival. A literate child could read instructions, record accounts, or send letter skills that made the difference between progress and stagnation. And then there were gatherings, small but precious. Harvest festivals celebrated the end of grueling seasons of work. Families brought what they could: cornbread, stews, pies, and shared meals under the glow of lanterns. Fiddles played, feet tapped, and voices rose in song. For a few hours, the hardships of frontier life faded, replaced by the warmth of human togetherness. Children ran in circles, men swapped stories, and women exchanged recipes and remedies. The community, however fragile, was alive. Even in times of sorrow, the bonds of community held firm. When illness or tragedy struck, neighbors stepped in. A widow would not be left alone to harvest, her fieldsmen would come to cut grain, women to cook meals, children to carry water. Graves, too, were dug by neighbors' hands, with funerals drawing the scattered settlement together in solemn unity. Death was frequent on the frontier, but no one buried their dead without the presence of others standing beside them. These connections mattered because they meant survival was no longer born alone. A family might provide meat from a successful hunt, while another shared milk from a cow, another eggs from hens. Skills were traded as much as goods: one man's knowledge of blacksmithing, another's ability with herbs, a woman's skill in midwifery. Together, they created something stronger than individuals could manage on their own. Over time, these threads of community wove settlements into small towns. A general store might appear, carrying nails, flour, and fabric. A blacksmith set up a forge, filling the air with the clang of iron. Soon, roads were cut, mail routes established, and the wilderness, though never truly tamed, was transformed into a place where life, fragile but resilient, could flourish. Community was not a luxury on the frontier. It was a necessity. In the face of danger, loss, and loneliness, human connection gave settlers the strength to continue. Alone, a person could struggle and fail. Together, they endured. The wilderness may have been vast, but within its heart grew small circles of belonging, glowing like lanterns against the darkness. If the frontier demanded strength of the body, it demanded even more of the mind. To live in the wilderness was to live with silence, not the gentle silence of peace, but the heavy, echoing silence of isolation. It pressed against families in their cabins, seeped into long nights, and lingered in the pauses between daily labor. For many, loneliness was as much a struggle as hunger or cold, and its toll was slow but relentless. Imagine a cabin on the edge of the forest. Snow piles high against the walls. Wind howls through the trees, rattling loose shutters. Inside, a family sits by the fire, the only source of warmth in the endless winter night. The world beyond their walls stretches for miles, but no one else is near. Weeks might pass before they see another soul. The nearest town is a day's journey too far in snow or storm. The silence becomes a companion, sometimes comforting, sometimes suffocating. Children felt it first. With no other young voices nearby, They grew up in small worlds bounded by their cabins and the woods outside. Their games were simple, often solitary, and their laughter rare. Some became shy, uneasy in the presence of strangers when at last they encountered them. Others developed a deep imagination, inventing companions, stories, and worlds of their own to fill the long hours of quiet. For women, loneliness carried a sharper edge. Days stretched with endless labor, cooking, sewing, mending, nursing children, tending gardens. Work was constant, but conversation was scarce. A mother might go weeks without speaking to anyone beyond her own children and husband. Letters from family back east were treasures, read and reread until the ink faded. Each word bridged the miles, reminding her she had once belonged to another world, a place with bustling streets, neighbors close at hand, and the sound of voices always near. Men, too, felt the weight of solitude. Many spent long hours hunting or working fields, alone, accompanied only by the creak of leather, the crack of an axe, or the rustle of leaves. Some bore it with quiet endurance. Others broke beneath it. Frontier diaries sometimes spoke of men who, unable to withstand the silence, abandoned their homesteads and vanished into the wilderness or returned east, never to speak of the loneliness they had endured. Winter deepened the sense of isolation. Snow closed off roads, ice sealed rivers, and storms kept families indoors for days on end. Cabin fever was more than a saying, it was a creeping sense of restlessness, claustrophobia, and despair. Arguments flared easily, patience wore thin, and the smallest frustrations could feel unbearable when there was no escape, no one else to turn to, no relief from the confinement. Even the strongest faith was tested. Some found solace in prayer, in the belief that God heard their voices, even when no neighbor could. Hymns sung in soft tones filled empty rooms with a kind of sacred companionship. But others felt abandoned, crying out in their journals that the wilderness was too vast, too empty, too merciless to be endured. And yet, in the strange way of the frontier, loneliness also built resilience. Families learned to lean more heavily on one another. Children grew close to their parents. Siblings became inseparable companions. And marriages, though tested by strains, sometimes deepened into bonds of unbreakable trust. With no one else to turn to, people turned inward, finding strength they did not know they had. Letters, when they arrived, were lifelines. A few folded sheets of paper, carried across miles by stagecoach or rider, brought news of weddings, births, and harvests back home. They reminded settlers that they were not forgotten, that a wider world still existed beyond the trees and plains. The arrival of a letter was cause for joy, and its words sustained families through long weeks of silence. Some settlers fought loneliness by creating small rituals. A woman might keep a journal, pouring her thoughts into ink, as though speaking to a friend. A man might carve figures from wood during long nights, giving shape to the people he missed. Families told stories by firelight, repeating tales of ancestors, legends of the land, and memories of cities or villages they had left behind. In this way, the spoken word became company, carrying the past into the present and filling the cabin with echoes of voices long absent. But even with these coping strategies, loneliness left marks. It aged people before their time, deepened lines on their faces, and left a shadow in their eyes. The frontier was a place of opportunity, but it was also a place of quiet sorrow, where laughter was rare and companionship scarce. Survival demanded not only strong hands, but strong hearts that could bear the weight of silence without breaking. And yet, as the years passed, communities grew. Slowly, the silence was broken by the sound of wagons arriving, neighbors moving closer, schools being built, and churches raising their steeples. Loneliness remained, but it softened as voices filled the spaces where once there had been only wind in the end. The story of frontier loneliness is one of endurance. People endured because they had no choice, because survival required it, and because within that endurance lay the faint but steady hope that tomorrow might bring company, connection, and the sound of another human voice carried across the wild. When we look back at frontier life, it is tempting to see only the struggle, the endless labor, the biting winters, the hunger that gnawed at bellies, the loneliness that pressed in like fog. And it is true, survival on the edge of civilization demanded everything. It stripped people down to their rawest selves and asked them to give more, endure more, believe more than they ever thought possible. But within that struggle lies a story not of defeat, but of resilience. The families who settled the wilderness did not live easy lives. They rose before dawn, worked until darkness, and often went to bed hungry. They faced dangers from wild beasts, storms, and sickness. They buried children, spouses, and parents in graves dug by their own hands, and yet they remained. Day after day, they chose to continue. That choice, repeated thousands of times across thousands of cabins, is what carved permanence out of wilderness. In the face of hardship, they built. They raised barns and cabins, schools and churches. They built towns from scattered settlements, roads from narrow trails, and communities from loneliness. Out of silence, they created voices. Out of danger, they created safety. Out of despair, they created faith. Their resilience was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, steady, and persistent, the kind of courage that rarely makes headlines but that changes history all the same. A mother staying strong through childbirth with no doctor nearby. A father splitting wood with frost-bitten hands. A child fetching water from a frozen creek. These small acts, repeated every day, were the backbone of survival. The frontier shaped character in ways both harsh and profound. It taught people the value of resourcefulness, how to make do with little, how to fix what was broken, how to survive with what could be grown, hunted, or crafted. It taught endurance, the ability to carry on even when the odds seemed impossible. And it taught solidarity, that survival was not achieved alone, but through the bonds of community. Through neighbors who came when barns fell, when sickness spread, when hunger threatened. And yet, perhaps its greatest lesson was humility. The wilderness was vast, and no human effort could ever truly tame it. Storms still came, fires still raged, illness still struck. The frontier reminded people, day after day, of their fragility. And in that fragility, many discovered a deeper strength, faith, gratitude, and the understanding that life itself, no matter how difficult, was a gift worth fighting for. The children of the frontier carried these lessons forward. They grew up hardened by work, shaped by silence, and strengthened by community. They became the teachers, the preachers, the builders, and the dreamers of the next generation. What they inherited was not wealth but resilience, not comfort but grit, not ease but an unshakable will. They built the foundation of a nation not through grand gestures but through the daily act of survival. And so, the story of frontier life is not only a story of hardship, it is a story of endurance and quiet triumph. It is the story of people who looked into the wilderness, saw its dangers, and decided to stay anyway. It is the story of families who planted seeds in soil that resisted them, who endured winters that seemed endless, and who built lives in places where life itself seemed impossible tonight. As you listen, let the weight of their endurance wrap around you like a blanket. Imagine the quiet cabin, the fire flickering low, the family gathered close. Imagine the long winters, the endless work, the loneliness, yes, but also the resilience. The laughter shared over meager meals, the songs sung into the silence, the courage carried in every small act, because, in the end, the frontier was not conquered by heroes or legends. It was endured by ordinary people whose courage was not in grand battles, but in the simple act of living, day after day, against the odds. Their legacy is not written only in history books, but in the very spirit of resilience that still runs through us today. So close your eyes and let that story of endurance carry you into rest. For though the frontier was harsh, it was also proof of what the human spirit can bear and how, even in the loneliest wilderness, we find ways to survive, to connect, and to hope.